Good afternoon. My name is Mary Fauver Holmes, and as a member of the Author Selection Committee for the festival, I have the best job of all. Our next author, Tess Gunty, our final speaker today, is the winner of the National Book Award for Fiction, and that makes her a really big deal. Her award comes for The Rabbit Hutch, her debut novel. And I wasn't sure, so I asked. She is one of the youngest writers ever to win that award. Philip Roth was just a little younger. She's in good company. The list of early prizes that her book earned at publication is impressive and could fill my whole allotted time up here. But nothing compares to the National Book Award for Fiction. And just recently, Tess Gunty was nominated as a finalist for the John Leonard Prize for the Best First Book, an award to be announced March 23rd. It's sponsored by the National Book Critics Circle Award. So that's pretty amazing, right? The Rabbit Hutch is set in a fictional, has-been industrial town in Indiana. It takes place in La Lapinière affordable housing complex. Depending on your own memory of high school French, you might catch the reference of lapin and rabbits. While it is about some of the residents of this dilapidated apartment building, I promise you, it is not about a bunch of rodents reproducing irresponsibly. The plot is actually quite complex and gripping. Action focuses primarily on four 18 and 19-year-olds recently emancipated from the foster care system. They all have jobs, and they seem to manage fairly well. But the girl, Blandine, is the real standout. She is beautiful, brilliant, a bit precocious, and obsessed with the medieval mystic Hildegard von Bingen, and with transcendence. Blandine wants to save her town and to fix all the social injustices of her environment. Sounds a lot like your basic, regular, old, idealistic teenager, right? But Blandine is far more than that. The book is current, deep, and edgy all at the same time. Gunty grew up in South Bend, Indiana, and after graduation from Notre Dame, she moved to New York to further her studies. She received her master's in fine arts at NYU and started writing The Rabbit Hutch. She and her partner moved west a couple years before the pandemic and now live in Silver Lake with their cats. Tess Gunty, we are so glad you are here. It's all yours.
I do have a rat story, but I'm afraid of going over time, so maybe we'll save it. But I've really enjoyed, that's been a highlight today. I want to thank everyone. It's such a pleasure to learn from my fellow authors and to be here among all of you, to learn from you as well. This is just such a hopeful community. And the more I kind of get to know the book reading and book making communities, the more I realize how they're powered by a really beautiful kind of goodwill and a kind of care toward each other. So I'm just really happy to be here. One of my earliest memories is a dream. It was a recurring dream that must have dug an expedited route into my neural pathways when my brain was just beginning to develop. Every night I hoped this dream would pull me into it. In the dream, I found a small hidden door in our laundry room. I'd open it, crawl through, and enter an expansive, zero-gravity realm of light, where I floated in some of the purest euphoria I have ever known. For years, when I woke from this dream, I would run from my bed to the basement, ransacking buckets of clothes, running my hands along the exposed pipes and cement and cobwebs, always believing that I would find the door, that it must exist. Our laundry room was cramped and unfinished, a place of chaos, one bare light bulb dangling from the ceiling like the lure of an anglerfish. Years passed, and this dream gave way to others, but I never stopped searching for that door. To tell the story of my formation as a writer is also to tell the story of my hometown, South Bend, Indiana. My debut novel, The Rabbit Hutch, takes place in a fictional post-industrial city called Vacaville. I consider Vacaville the protagonist of the novel and consider the novel a choral ode to the Rust Belt. While I modeled Vacaville in a number of Rust Belt towns, including Flint, Michigan, Gary, Indiana, and Youngstown, Ohio, it is undeniable that my hometown was my entrance into this imaginary place. I lived in South Bend for the first 22 years of my life, with a 9-month exception when I studied in Angers, France. Situated on the border of Michigan, an hour and a half from Chicago, South Bend is a place of contradictions. It was the home of both Pete Buttigieg and Amy Coney Barrett, not to mention Mike Pence. Indiana, not South Bend. It's a university town where 70% of the residents do not hold a college degree. It's a place of sagging strip malls, car dependence, disposable urban design, abandoned factory buildings, Catholic churches, long winters, humid summers, a crumbling downtown theater, a peregrine falcon cam, and a nearly permanent ceiling of low gray clouds. It is surrounded by sublime geometries of corn and soybean monocrops. South Bend, so named because it is nestled on the southern bend of the St. Joseph River, suffered 2 historic floods back-to-back, a 1,000-year flood in 2016 and a 500-year flood just 18 months later. Indiana has the most polluted natural waterways of any state, mostly due to agricultural runoff and poor regulations. A study conducted on the St. Joseph River in 2016, the year of the flood, found levels of organic pollutants 10 times higher than the quality guidelines, mostly from the combustion of fossil fuels. South Bend was once the home of Studebaker Automobiles, which in its heyday was the largest car manufacturing facility in America. It began as a humble wagon business and rapidly grew into the longest living vehicle company in the world, reigning as the primary source of town identity, pride, and employment for about a century. A black, eerily funereal Studebaker barouche drove Abraham Lincoln to the theater where he would be assassinated. I was born in 1992, 3 decades after Studebaker closed. Throughout my childhood, I knew little of the company's history. I knew that we were haunted, but I did not know that we were haunted by the ghost of Studebaker. Indeed, I knew nothing of the Studebaker family until I began to research them for my novel. I grew up in neighborhoods that had been populated by factory workers, but I only discovered this a few weeks ago. The brutality of the extraction economy was unusually visible in my hometown, a place conjured into existence by an industry and then just as swiftly abandoned by it. Yet it didn't occur to me to investigate the asteroid that pummeled this land into harrowing craters until I left at 22. It would be inaccurate to attribute all the intergenerational pain in South Bend to the closure of Studebaker. But the economic decline made our city all the more vulnerable to long-standing national emergencies, like the climate crisis, inadequate healthcare systems, the prison industrial complex, lethal gun policies, and white supremacy. As the pandemic illustrated clearly, any crisis reveals and exacerbates pre-existing ones. I know plenty of people in my hometown who, dressed in the steel armor of wealth, have always been protected from these crises. Indeed, some will insist that the craters I described do not exist, have never existed. But I was raised in pressurized communities full of people who were blamed for failing to take routes that were closed to them long before they were born. And so despite my own armor of social protection, I could not deny what I saw. Many of my high school friends who lived in an alternate universe of gated communities and new cars and winter cruises called my neighborhood the ghetto and said their parents wouldn't let them walk around in it. My brothers and I attended Catholic schools enabled by a tuition benefit that my mother received in exchange for teaching at a Catholic high school. Our elementary school religion teacher was an unpredictable woman who would sometimes hurl chalk at us and often talked about how hot she found her husband. She was in her 60s, which was kind of badass. I was like, cool, you find your husband so hot. When my classmates and I were 10 or so, she taught us a new term, purgatory. It's a place where almost everyone ends up after they die, she said. Neither heaven nor hell. Purgatory was an in-between place and no place, a wasteland of indefinite waiting and eternal longing and unquenchable thirst. You never knew how long you would stay there, she said. I pictured it as a small, windowless waiting room with flickering fluorescent lights. You had to wait until someone alive said the prayer to St. Gertrude and set you free, explained our teacher. Every time this prayer is said, she continued, exactly 1,000 souls are released from purgatory. She distributed photocopies of the prayer, made us memorize it, and began every subsequent class by obliging us to recite it. If someone had trouble with the memorization, she would yell, "Think of your grandfather." Do you want him to be trapped there forever? On the chalkboard, she kept a running tally of the souls that her students and she had released. And at the end of the school year, she would announce the grand total. But what struck me most about this fairly absurd experience was how familiar her definition of purgatory sounded to me. Don't we already live there, I thought. I had long suspected that we did not live in a city at all, but rather in an afterlife, and that in fact what we did there was not quite living, because we were already dead. No, we were waiting. Throughout my upbringing, the rates of poverty, unemployment, addiction, nonviolent crime, and violent crime were higher than the state of Indiana's averages and dramatically higher than the national averages. Local public schools consistently received F grades when assessed by the state. When I was a teenager, South Bend ranked second on Newsweek's macabre list of the top 10 dying American cities. On a laptop screen, drained of breath and blood and frozen into an Arctic spreadsheet, post-industrial decline looks like numbers. But in the galaxy of our small neighborhood, a material realm of grass and bare feet, fireflies and ethanol fumes, sparrows and trash, felled trees and singular bodies, a place of heartbeats and onceness, decline looks different. It looks like a woman screaming at a line of laundry in her yard, the cotton shivering and agitated in front of her. It looks like the van that arrives to ferry your friend's mother to a psychiatric ward, so many years too late. It looks like drawn blinds in the daylight, a father in front of the television, always in front of that television, with the company of glass bottles, the color of your toxic river. It looks like bullet holes through the signage of a corner store that you walk to for cans of tuna and incense and illicit cigars. It looks like a ransacked home stripped of sheets and robbed of electronics that your parents could hardly afford in the first place. It looks like death at 50 from a preventable disease. It looks like a Facebook message from a boy with whom you spent your 16th summer riding horses and flirting, writing to say that his bomb detection dog in Afghanistan has your name. He went to war because he could not afford college. It looks like tears on the face of your childhood friend who has just learned that her brother has been arrested for using the same drugs that your brothers use, and the difference between their fates is the difference between their skin color. Tears on the same face years later, now swollen from the force of a young man's fist. It sounds like he hit me because I wouldn't sleep with him. It sounds like a doorbell in the middle of the night, and it looks like a man on your welcome mat, bleeding from a gunshot wound, begging for help. It sounds like bullets and police cars, ambulances and silence. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the beauty that is also found in this place. Throughout my teens and early 20s, I worked at a bakery that operated a booth at the farmer's market. This market is one of my favorite places on earth, not so much for its merchandise, which is nice enough, but rather for its rare electricity of mutual goodwill. It fosters community the way that good urban design is supposed to foster community. People of all incomes, faiths, and histories would find themselves together, forming lines to buy the Diafix soft pretzels from the Amish family who'd operated the stand for decades, or to buy bouquets of wildflowers and cartons of blueberries grown in Michigan, or handmade jewelry for a wedding. People would stop by my booth and chat with me for hours, accurately perceiving an enchanted audience. I befriended a mechanic who had to give up work when a degenerative nerve condition revealed itself in him. He came to the market every day it was open. This was his church, his family. I met a retired opera singer whose family forbid her to marry the man she loved and instead forced her to marry someone who abused her. On Christmas Eve, in a harrowing, emptied, in a hollowed-out market, she clutched my hand with tears in her eyes and told me that I should live, that I should travel, that I should never, ever settle. I came to know a veteran who survived World War II by holding the photo of a woman he loved close to his chest every night. And then, 65 years later, as he was mourning her loss, he showed me that very photo, which he kept in the tabernacle of his wallet. My booth was beside that of a trusted leather maker in his 80s, who communicated not through words so much as gestures, wry smiles, butterscotch candies that he left for me on my stand. I loved these people. There is no other verb to describe what happens when the best immaterial part of you leaps toward the best immaterial part of someone else and embraces it. While none of these stories are replicated in my novel, these voices were the music I heard as I wrote. These were the people who awakened me to the truest nature of our home. Yes, it was a place of pain. but it is also varied, vast, mysterious, tender, alive, changeable, earthly and otherworldly, unbearably beautiful. You'll notice that I am in the middle of this talk on my formation as a writer, and I have not mentioned my writing. I confess that my original draft was 3 times the maximum length, and I wanted to tell you about a lot of other things. I wanted to tell you about my extraordinary parents, an art teacher and a sociologist who nourished my love for stories even before I could read or write. I wanted to tell you about my 3 older brothers who are musicians, poets, and artists themselves. One my first friend on earth, one my great inspiration, one my first reader and trusted advisor. I wanted to pay tribute to my teachers, the scary story contest at my local public library, the local young authors conference I attended for years in childhood and still associate with the rare permission to eat donuts. I wanted to describe my friend's mother who assigned us writing exercises and made the invention of fiction feel as fun as anything we'd ever done. I could have described my middle school and high school attempts at novels. I thought I'd mention the writing contest that my mother made me enter at 17. She likes to remind me that I was a brat during the submission process, protesting all the way and complaining that I just wanted to go home and take a very long shower. But she knew what I couldn't have known at the time, that when a young writer with very little confidence in a small town receives validation from strangers who know what they're talking about, she may begin to believe that she has something to offer. As a result of that competition, one of my short stories was performed by actors on our regional NPR station, and I eventually found myself bowing, bewildered in a $20 dress among a group of fellow teenagers on the stage of Carnegie Hall. I wanted to tell you about the flight home from New York, reading the journal that this competition published every year. My writing was not selected. I wanted to describe the intoxication of the innovative, precise, and breathtaking work of writers I knew to be peers, and how, upon arriving home, I immediately ran to a Word document and began to write. Maybe I'd discuss my undergraduate education, which delivered an aesthetic revolution, conversion from my rigid conventional realism to a far more flexible and expansive approach to the novel. My time at the NYU MFA program, working alongside literary heroes and peers I considered geniuses and dear friends. The years afterward, during which I worked as a research assistant to my former professor on his book. The rejections, the odd jobs, the absence of health care, the 4 a.m. financial panic attacks, the nearly giving up, the 3 abandoned novels, the failed short story collection, the 5 years I spent on the Rabbit Hutch. I finished the manuscript only to achieve closure on it, but before I was done, I had decided I'd never submit it anywhere. So discouraged, insecure, and hopeless was I by then. I splurged on nice binding at a FedEx and slotted the manuscript on a shelf. Months later, though, at the behest of an angelic friend, I did submit it to agents. Shortly after that, the book sold. I want to tell you about Andrew, my partner whose unconditional support for and belief in my work sustained me during every crisis and triumph. I could talk about access to reproductive health care, which was essential in my formation as a writer. I received an abortion 10 months before my book published, 4 months before the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. Had I not been free to terminate that pregnancy, I wouldn't have been free to celebrate and promote the thing that had been alive to me for 5 years. I wouldn't have been able to launch the career that I had been working toward, fighting for, protecting, and nurturing my entire life. When I was squinting into the lights on the stage at the National Book Awards ceremony a few months ago, the most astonished I had ever been in my life, without a speech, quite literally speechless, the loudest thought in my head was, I would not be standing here had I been forced to give birth a month ago. How many people will have to relinquish what is most important to them because a minority of tyrannical extremists have outlawed their rights? But as you can see, I have spent most of this talk addressing none of the above and instead describing a small city in northern Indiana. You might ask why. One answer is that they are indistinguishable, inextricably bound. As a writer, you are formed by the events of your career, but you are also formed by the observations, encounters, and sensations that suspend you, however briefly, above your own life. As you write, these experiences whisper instructions to you in languages you once understood and momentarily understand again. They pull back the velvet curtain of life, reveal the props and machines and costumes backstage. They gesture to the dark matter in the pot of tagine, to the mysteries in the feathers of a malnourished swan, the afterlife in a mound of carnations, to whatever exists beyond and below this experiment. These are not the mystical experiences described by the medieval nuns who captivate the protagonist of my novel. They are mundane. They do not answer questions. They wield no creed. And insofar as they suggest divinity, it is a choral and pedestrian divinity found on dusty streets and hot tray platforms, in landfills of trash and industrial fishing nets, in rosé swims and gas stations, in the humid, hectic, crowded life of a night market, in the eyes of your next-door neighbor, your childhood friend in a small, dying city in Indiana, who is holding her newborn baby as you are holding your college diploma, and she is so much happier than you have ever seen her before. You may recall that I made the ill-advised decision to open this lecture by recounting a dream. I did this because I think that the dream illustrates two essential truths about my formation as a writer. The first is that I am endlessly seeking realms without gravity, realms of absolute freedom and light. When the writing is going well, it suspends you in such a place. The neuroscience of flow state, that is dissociative, intemporal hyperfocus that propels the best creativity, shares much in common with the neuroscience of transcendent spiritual experiences. This is a sensation I have been chasing for as long as I can remember. The second truth that this dream reveals has to do with the door rather than the room. When I was growing up, I was a voracious and basically indiscriminate reader, but I never encountered a novel that was set in a town like mine, so I never set my own fiction in a town like mine. This is my first published novel, but it was preceded by thousands and thousands of pages of practice, beginning when I was 4, and I would create pages of linked illustrations and then dictate the stories to my father, who lovingly transcribed them. Yet my fiction was always set in an imagined land, or a city I'd visited once, or a city I'd just seen in movies. Literature doesn't happen in towns like South Bend, Indiana. That was the message I had internalized. It took me a long time to understand the danger of that message. If you believe that the narratives produced within and around you are meaningless, you will be divested of political and creative will. It is no coincidence that my fiction came to life when I insisted on seeing what I already saw, when I realized that the neglected people and places I'd known all my life were worthy of very, very close attention. Not just the attention of publishers in Manhattan or prize committees, but first and foremost my own attention. I don't believe that dreams are there to teach us lessons, but I do think that they can reveal what we already know. The dream suggested that the door I was seeking could be found in the place where I already lived. Not only was it found in my house, but I think it is significant that the portal to this utopia was located in the ugliest, messiest, smallest, coldest room in our house. I am comfortably agnostic about most things. The existence of God, whether consciousness can be generated in a non-biological machine, the likelihood that we are living in a multiverse or a simulation, what happens after we die, what happens after capitalism, what to make of the double-slit experiment or quantum superposition or any of the other subatomic mysteries discovered but not yet explained, the existence of aliens, the origin of it all. No, the desire to answer any of these howling questions evacuated me long ago. Perhaps the dogma of my religious youth, that fire of wrong answers, smoked it out. But there are a few things that I am comfortable claiming here in this ballroom in front of you. I believe that it is essential to look the dark matter of life in the eye. I believe that every revolution, personal or collective, begins with close attention. The work of becoming a writer is the work of tuning yourself to frequencies that are only audible when everything else goes quiet, of sensitizing yourself to light that is only visible when everything else goes dark. It is the work of welcoming shadow and silence. It is the work of fully believing that other lives, human and non-human, future and past, are as real as yours. Close attention to oneself and others is the beginning of kindness, justice, reform, utopia, and art. I was never going to find that door in the laundry room of my waking life, but I did find it. I found it where it existed all along, in my mind. Thank you.
So, I understand that the stunning graphics at the end of the book representing Todd's comics were a collaborative project with your brother. Can you tell us something about how that came about and how it worked?
Yes, so I had this idea from the very early stages of writing this book. I knew that one of my characters was a kind of comic artist. He loved to make illustrations. He was a very closed-off character, and so it was hard to access him. But there was one scene in particular that seemed to be suited to visual representation because there was a lot of action going on. So I knew that writing out, verbally what was going on might be confusing, and I thought this would be a solution to a problem. So I told my brother, who's a great visual artist, and he does a lot of different kinds of work. He's also a musician. I told him about it the first year I started writing this novel, and he was like, yes, and we're also going to make a YouTube video, because there's like a YouTube link, and he's like, we're going to take it down, and that was too complicated ultimately. But by the time I got the book deal, I still hadn't collaborated with him on this. So I asked my publisher, Knopf, if they were open to the idea. They said, go for it. And I began to work with Nick, my brother. And he's a very easy person to collaborate with. He kind of understood immediately the aesthetic of the book, what I was looking for. But he also enhanced it right away, because I was thinking this would be a kind of literal interpretation of the action of the scene. And he said, why don't we make it more of a figurative interpretation? Let's make it more like it's Todd's confession or Todd's defense. That's the character's name, Todd. And so as we collaborated, he did various drafts. I asked him to tweak things. And finally, he made the final images. And I think it was this kind of wonderful example of how collaboration can end up enriching something and teaching you about your own characters in a way that no other writing experience had.
Thank you. Did your brother stay in South Bend?
No, he lives now in Philadelphia.
The Rabbit Hutch has both wonderful and disturbing insights into how the internet and social media are shaping human interaction and how we see ourselves. As a writer, what interests you about the relationship between our online selves and our real selves?
I mean, this is an enormous subject, and I feel like I'm constantly still refining my thinking on it. But I mean, for the most part, I'm interested in this the kind of experimentation of it that we're all experiencing. We don't really know the effects that the internet is going to have on us in a long-term way, but we do know that the people that we are online are not quite the people that we are in reality. So I'm really interested in what happens when you remove all of the kind of restrictions and responsibilities of inhabiting a body in the material world, and when you can be anyone with no responsibility for what you say or do. I find that the kindness that people show there and the tenderness is a lot more moving and interesting, actually, than the cruelty. Cruelty has its limits for how interesting it can be. But the kindness that people show each other is endlessly fascinating to me and much more meaningful.
Elsie Blitz is a great character. Who or what inspired you in creating this funny, frank, and somewhat tragic character?
Well, she came to me when I was looking at an obituary website, and I found a singer that I had never heard of. She was in her 90s when she passed away, but she had this cult following because her guest book online was filled with all this admiration and love from her fans. And I even looked her up, and I just couldn't find that much about her. So I thought, this is fascinating. There's someone who has developed this kind of ardent fan base and yet has not really left a digital trace of herself. And so she kind of inspired Elsie Blitz, although Elsie Blitz became a character who was actually a celebrity, a child actress when she was quite young. And then I think I was thinking a lot in very explicit terms about the extraction economy when I was writing this book. And I was thinking about the kind of factories that produce vehicles in this town, but also the factories that produce American dreams and narratives. And so that led me to thinking about Hollywood. And I kind of wanted to conduct an experiment where I showed a character who was ostensibly benefiting from the extraction economy. She was wealthy, she was famous, but she was the resource that was being extracted, and that also made her suffer. Like even the people who seem to be benefiting from these systems are not.
Where was I? Oh, yes. Could you talk to us a little bit about Hildegard von Bingen? And how you came to her?
Yeah. She is such an amazing historic figure. So she was born in 1098 in Germany. She was the 10th of 10 children, and her family donated her to the church, which was a common practice of the time. And so she grew up, spent her whole life really in this convent, and a lot of it was actually spent in seclusion with just this one or two other nuns. And she is a polymath. She's considered the founder of natural history in Germany. She invented a language. She writes a lot of music. She's most known for her music, actually, within the Catholic tradition. But she was also just an intellectual powerhouse. She was so confident in her intelligence. And I was reading a lot of writings from the female Catholic mystic traditions. And what bothered me about a lot of it was that the women tended to adopt a sort of submissive tone, even in their writings, but Hildegard didn't. I mean, only when she was manipulating a bishop or something would she say, "Oh, I'm just a little woman. What do I know?" But in her work, in her spiritual writings, and even in her medical texts, there's this unabashed confidence about her brain. And I read one of her medical texts recently, and like some of it is very accurate, and then other things are like essentially witchcraft. Like there's like sew hamster skins together and put it on, and then you'll be cured. And there was like no doubt in her mind that she could be this. She didn't ask anyone's permission to be all of these things. She just embodied all of it.
Did you learn about her in Catholic school?
I never learned about her. I think that people I know who studied music and, in Catholic contexts study her, but I didn't come across her until I was writing this book. I had heard of other sort of mystical female figures, and they led me to her.
So you were looking for a mystical figure?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Well, that's good.
That's in the market.
Do you ever see yourself moving back to the Midwest, specifically Indiana?
I think you can never say never, but for now, I think only my parents are there, and there's not really anything for me there. I don't have any friends. I don't know what I would do. But I think if I had the right context, opportunity, job, I would definitely consider it.
So talking about Vacaville, it's a Midwest city, and you spoke about it. It's facing the encroachment of corporate developments, and it seems to symbolize the decline of Middle America or cities like South Bend. But it's home. It's home to its residents, like you. So how important were the notions of home and rootedness to you while writing this story? And I think you touched on it a bit.
Yeah, that was extremely important to me. I think it was a question that was sort of appearing to me throughout the writing process. What is home? What is family? I mean, most of my characters in this book are orphaned in one way or another by the time we meet them. Either their parents have died, or they never knew their parents, or they're estranged. And so all of them are trying to carve out different types of home within the very limited resources they have. And one thing that really strikes me whenever I reflect on this is just how random this fate is. I mean, the factors that are really the tyrants of every life are mostly unchosen factors, where you happen to be born, when you happen to be born, to what family. And yet we all make do with the sort of allotments that were granted at birth. And so balancing this sort of the hostility of such a place with the innate feelings of attachment and tenderness that my characters had toward it was, I think, essential in trying to portray it accurately.
One last question. As a National Book Award winner, we all want to know, what are you working on now?
On a second novel, and my instinct is to talk about it, but I am trying this new thing where I don't talk about it. So I will say, though, that it follows 3 different characters.
Thank you. And now I think Nora's going to come up.
Thank you, Tess, and thank you to all of the fabulous authors here today. Sadly, we're at the end of the program, but there's still book buying and book signing outside. We hope you had a great time.